First, I'd like to welcome our Chancellor, Elizabeth Alexander, who's just joined us, and ladies and gentlemen. And we have two speakers in this session who'll be looking at India and the great powers. Each speaker will present for approximately 15 minutes, so I will introduce both of them up front so we can get things moving and get onto a Q&A session fairly soon. I'll start by introducing the second speaker, who is Rory Metcalfe. He's Director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute for International Policy in Sydney, and he's also Senior Research Fellow in Indian Strategic Affairs at the University of New South Wales. He's followed Australia's relations with India for some time now, and he convenes the Australia-India Roundtable, which is a 1.5-track strategic dialogue between the two countries. His collaboration with the Australia-India Institute involves workshops and research on India-China relations, as well as directing the Lowy India Poll. He has a very varied professional background that spans intelligence, journalism, and diplomacy. He's worked as a senior strategic analyst with the Office of National Assessment, and he has experience as an Australian diplomat. He had a posting in New Delhi from 2000 to 2003. His research interests are many and varied. They include Asian geopolitics, the rise of India and China, India-China relations, India foreign policy and its domestic drivers, Indian media, nuclear arms control, maritime security, Australian foreign and defence policy, and Australia-India relations. And he's going to be speaking on India-China relations past and present. Monica Viziani will be speaking first up. She has a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. She's Professor of Asian Political Economy at Monash University, and from 2001 to 2011 she directed the Monash Asia Institute. She's published scores or up to over 100 refereed journal articles and chapters, 15 books, and her research area mainly focuses on how mass poverty and discrimination intersect with long-term development and security. She's been working on India for around 37 years, and her field work there has tallied at least 6 years. She's done a lot of work on the untouchables, and her current work looks at Muslim minorities in both India and China, and she's going to speak, and will speak now, on India-US strategic relations. Monica, I welcome you to the podium.
Thank you very much to the organisers, Professor Matu, Robin, colleagues, participants, visitors. 37 years working on India makes me feel like the grand old Australian lady on India, something which I'm very proud of, although in the last 10 years I've also been working in Western China. This paper began in 2005, before Professor Matu took up his appointment and came up with the idea for today's conference. In 2005, I asked the question, will India become a client state of the US? Why did I ask that question? At that time, Manishankar Iyer was Union Cabinet Minister for Petroleum and Natural Gas. At the time, in mid-2005, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was visiting Washington. At that time, Manishankar Iyer was very brave in seizing the initiative to develop the IPI gas pipeline project, the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline, as a solution to India's critical energy shortage. Unfortunately, Mr. Manmohan Singh in Washington found this terribly embarrassing because of US sanctions, and it was at that time that India began tilting towards the US. And I asked the question at a conference organized at Curtin University a couple of weeks after Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's visit to the US. I asked the question, who was expressing India's real foreign policy? Who was really in charge? Was it Manishankar Iyer or was it the Indian Prime Minister? Recently this year, WikiLeaks has released various cables that provide more background information about what was happening at this time. And of course, we know that in early 2006, Manishankar Iyer was replaced as Petroleum Minister. A new pro-US cabinet was installed in New Delhi, and it was very much the beginning of a new India-US relationship. And it was in this context that I asked that question, will India become a client state of the US? Needless to say, when I then discovered that Manishankar Iyer himself was going to be not only a guest today, but the first keynote speaker, I was terribly pleased and very excited, because I have certainly followed his ideas with great interest. The other reason why I asked the question, is India at risk of becoming a client state of the US, is to do with the work that in 2005 I began to undertake with a number of my PhD students comparing the military preparedness of India and China. And one reason I'm interested in that question is that for many, many years, Oliver Mendelsohn and I have been good friends of N.N. Vohra. And Mr. Vohra, of course, has a distinguished history as a diplomat, a head of the Corruption Commission and an interlocutor for Jammu Kashmir, but he's also said on a number of occasions to me that every time India and China sit down to resolve the ongoing issues to do with the Indo-China border, India is at a growing disadvantage. And in this paper, I'm adopting what's called in academia a realist framework. I'm looking at the real power politic that has to begin, I believe, our understanding of India has to begin by looking at what India is not good at. We know what India is good at. We know about the trade, the investment, the IT, Silicon Valley, etc. But what is India not good at, in particular relative to China? In 2005, I made the following 4 points. Indian military expenditure is woeful compared to China, about 1/8. China in the late 1990s had already emerged as the world's 7th largest arms exporter. Australia, by comparison, was only 12th. India was nowhere to be seen. Not only that, but China was an exporter of particular kinds of strategically significant armaments which reflect high levels of technology, such as missiles, aircraft, and naval aircraft, representing in 1999 4% of global trade, which was higher than Britain's share of global trade. And we do think of Britain as a major arms dealer. And finally, India was much more dependent on arms imports than China. 1.6% of all imports into India represented in, 1.6% of total imports relative to China, 0.5%. Now, these figures are to be taken lightly because there's a huge debate as to how do you really distinguish between what's so-called military and non-military imports and expenditure. Nevertheless, these figures come from the US government, and in preparing for today's presentation, I looked at the 29th report of the US on military expenditure. So those figures I've given you were true for 1999, but they haven't been revised. And in fact, the question now is, has anything changed since that early paper that I wrote in 2005? The answer is definitely not. In fact, India's military security situation is worse than it was in the late 1990s. I won't go into the details, but they are there in the paper that I've written that I believe will be published later this year. Indian military expenditure continues to lag China's. Perhaps Manishankar Iyer thinks this is a good thing. Maybe this is a legacy of Nehruvianism, but I don't think so. I was actually very tempted to suggest that my paper was not about a wounded power, but an incompetent power. But I've not used that word because I don't want to insult anyone. I don't want people to misinterpret what I mean by India's incompetence. It's to do with the enormous power of the civilian bureaucracy relative to the military controls. So in terms of military expenditure, India's way behind. If you look specifically at the nature of Indian military technology, despite the emphasis on indigenous investment and autarky, India developing its own indigenous capacities, India is terribly behind, and there are many, many scandals about no deliveries, late deliveries, incompetent deliveries, and so on. There's a terribly serious problem of human resources in the Indian armed forces. Dinesh Kumar, one of my PhD students, has had his paper recently published in an international journal on the officer crisis. You can't have a modern military, no matter how good IT, without good officers providing leadership. There's a lack of joint military command so that the Army, Air Force, and Navy do not work together. Only rarely does that happen, whereas joint command has become a major doctrine of modernization in contemporary China. And finally, and just as important as all of these things, domestic insurgencies. It's been estimated that 20% of India's military capacity is actually caught up in controlling domestic insurgencies. Now, in addition to the obvious ones along the borders of India and in the minority states in the far northeast, we have a serious domestic insurgency in the so-called Red Revolutionary Belt, where maybe 20% of the Indian armed forces are caught up in dealing with the emergence of Maoists, Naxalites, who believe that the Indian state has not delivered on its promises for development for the poorest of the poor. And estimates there of Naxal control vary from between 25% of Indian districts, some people say more than that, up to half of Indian districts, according to some individuals, are under Naxal control. This is really a very important thing that people don't know about India, and I personally experienced this late last year. I'm doing work with Omitted Bagchi at the Institute for Development Studies in Calcutta. We are trying to introduce point-of-care diagnostics for bad diseases in remote rural villages of West Bengal, with the support and permission, obviously, of the West Bengal government. And the two villages that we were originally allocated were unallocated because they'd been run over by Naxalites. And so late last year, we were allocated to other villages 5 hours north of Calcutta because they were relatively safe. So even a modest scholar drifting around the countryside of India is very much aware of the impact of these domestic insurgencies and what this means for the capacity of India to act as a power in the region. The third part of my paper focuses on US perceptions of India. Certainly, the idea of India being a reluctant superpower is a view that the United States has. And in the paper, I have analyzed very carefully the recent Indo-US strategic dialogue. And Hillary Clinton, who went there in July this year, where she said, it was time for India to lead. Quote, we encourage you, India, not just to look east, but to continue to engage and act east as well. Now, Hillary Clinton was referring, of course, not to hard military or strategic facts, but to soft power. In my paper, however, I have raised serious questions about India's soft power capacities. So needless to say, thank you very much for inviting Shashi Tharoor to address this very topic on Monday afternoon at your lecture at 6 p.m. In this room, is it? Right. India's soft power is seriously compromised, first of all, by human rights abuses. And again, I won't go into that, but I've spent much of my academic life looking at the untouchable minorities and more recently, the Islamic minorities. And also other minorities that we don't often hear about who suffer terribly, including transvestites. So that Upendra Bakshi talks about India may be a democracy in terms of elections, but down on the ground, the everyday reality is you have what he calls the micro-fascism of the Indian police state. Now, it's a serious problem. I may not choose the same words that Upendra Bakshi chooses. There's also the problematic nature of India's engagement with its neighbours, and in the paper I have focused on Bangladesh. We know how difficult that relationship is with Sri Lanka and with Pakistan and Afghanistan, but with Bangladesh, recently I was there in Dhaka for a 3-day workshop on the sharing of the waters of the Ganga and the Brahmaputra. And when you talk to Bangladeshis who are looking at climate change and the rather depressing scenarios that emerge from thinking of climate change, sitting on top of the terrible difficulties of water sharing and the inadequate water sharing agreements and implementations that define Indo-Bangladesh relations, you begin to understand why many Bangladeshis feel deeply alienated from India. At the same time, we have to admit that the younger generation is becoming very pro-Indian for totally different reasons. Because of popular culture, because of Bollywood, because of the excitement of IT, and so on. And in the end, there's a kind of a counterbalancing act here between what is the new mindset emerging amongst young people in Bangladesh, but ultimately, underlying all of this, hardcore, really difficult problems such as water sharing. And the symbolism attached by India, for example, building an entire fence around Bangladesh. So when Manishankar Iyer was talking about Nehru's role in trying to promote Middle East peace processes, I couldn't help but reflect the irony of this 2,000-kilometre fence that divides India and Bangladesh, built by India. And in the audience here, we have Rizwana Shamshad, whose PhD has a very nice chapter on that fence. So Hillary Clinton's optimism about India's soft power is not really shared by people in governments in the region or popular belief in the region either. So coming more specifically to the nature of the US-India engagement, disappointing at the moment. All American commentary talks about the lack of dynamism. Even the hope that India's military incompetence would somehow produce fabulous contracts for defense supplies in the US has been disappointing. President Obama this year described the US-India relationship as the partnership of the 21st century. But as the Brookings Institution academics point out, Stephen Cohen in particular, there have been far too many dialogues. Actually, there are 30 India-Australia dialogues, at least in Australia. John, we only have one big Australia-India conference at the moment. So lots of dialogues in the US and actually no results. And the reason for that is the difficult problems facing the US economy. And really the decline, I believe, of the US from its uncontested unipolar position. In the paper, I've given a detailed example of the disappointment that has come about in the India-US relationship as a result of what's happened to the US nuclear deal. It was a massive achievement to get the US to agree to allow India to develop civilian nuclear energy. But since Congress ratified that in 2008, it's been downhill ever since then. And it came unstuck August last year with the nuclear liability law, which says that US companies or any foreign company developing nuclear facilities in India, power facilities, must take responsibility for any problems or accidents. So now we have the funny situation whereby it's other companies in the world that are benefiting from the US initiative, in particular state-owned companies in France and Russia. On top of that, at the very moment that Hillary Clinton was visiting India in July this year, the Indian government announced that actually we don't need your uranium anymore. You know, for about 5 years, the government of India and Australia has been bending over backwards trying to persuade us to sell uranium to India, which we haven't done because of the nature of green politics in Australia. But now in July this year, it seems as if India may well have discovered its own internal significant uranium deposits. The final part of my paper looks at Indian responses to US overtures. At one level, you could say that India has ignored US sanctions. 18% of Indian oil imports continue to come from Iran, which is roughly the same as India buys in from Saudi Arabia. India has also been very proactive in ignoring the financial attempt by the US to prevent India from paying for that oil. Very innovative solutions by using a Turkish state-owned bank. But again, here, the uneasy relationship between India and the US is counterbalanced by other areas in which the two countries, for pragmatic reasons mentioned earlier on, are in agreement. And here I discuss, but cannot go into in any detail, the difference between the IPI, the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline, which Mani Shankar was pretty much his invention. That has been abandoned. And one of the reasons cited was, oh, you can't have a pipeline going through hundreds of kilometers of Balochistan because it's unsafe from insurgents and terrorists. So instead, let's have the TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, and let's have 700 kilometers going through Afghanistan, through the heart of the Taliban area instead. Now, obviously, the preferred pipeline at the moment is the TAPI. India and the US agree on that. And the reason for this is that there is Asian Bank development funding for the TAPI, and the US strategy is to engage India in Central Asia. The TAPI going through Afghanistan is going to generate revenues for poverty-stricken Afghanistan, which in itself, I think, is not a bad idea. But obviously, in terms of security, it's just as insecure as the IPI line. But the IPI line is not on the agenda because Iran is not on the agenda. So the United States has found India's attitude to be extremely disappointing. Very sad that all this US energy hasn't delivered many results, with that one exception of the TAPI. And on the matter of oil imports from Iran, well, the United States hasn't got much choice. Every country with serious energy shortages, such as India, has got to diversify energy supplies. So India cannot be pushed more than the United States has already pushed it, which leads me to my conclusion, and I'm probably over time? Yes. Okay, conclusions. It's now the US that wants to engage with India, whereas in 1998, it was India hoping that the United States would forgive it for its nuclear tests. Now, India is ambiguous about the United States, if we take the nuclear deal as a good example. India's military capacities are terrible. They're not just weakened, they're very, very limited. At a time when US economic capacities are very weak and getting weaker. This morning, as you know in the news, people are seriously talking about a US recession. Conclusion, the India-US relationship today is more equal than it's ever been, more equal than in 2005, when I first asked that question, will India become a client state of the US? And the answer is no. Now my new question is, can two wounded giants help each other? Help each other do what? Contain China. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Look, there's a few points of reference I might pick up as we go along there. Just check, is my PowerPoint loaded? It is, I believe. Yes, it is. All right, but somehow the first slide's disappeared. Look, thank you again. I'm really pleased to be here, and my congratulations to the organisers of this conference, particularly to Professor Matu and his team. Before I start, I just want to say that it clearly is India Week here in Australia. We've just hosted a dialogue at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, a dialogue between Australian and Indian officials, media representatives, business, think tank and scholarly communities, and I think that combined with this event here shows that at last the two countries are beginning to pay proper attention to each other, and that can only be a good thing, even if we disagree, and especially when we disagree. I also want to say that I'm very humbled to be here because I know there are some very accomplished and eminent colleagues in the room, and some very accomplished and eminent representatives of India in the room. Not only Manishankar Iyer, whose work on nuclear arms control I've always admired and respected, but also I know that coming to this conference will be Shyam Saran, former Indian Foreign Secretary, Ambassador K.C. Singh, and others. And a few questions in my mind that have come out of the earlier presentations today that I'll pick up on in my own brief presentation. I keep coming back to this thought: who is really in charge in India? I think there are many Indias, and I do think that for every assessment one hears about India's direction in the world, its choices in the world, and even interpretations of its history in the past 50 or 60 years, there are other views, and those views invariably come from other voices in India. So you'll hear a few things here that I guess don't sit neatly perhaps with some of the judgments we've heard earlier today, and that's only to the good. India is, after all, a democracy. And so what I've got to say on relations between India and China, I offer in a spirit of analysis, I think, rather than a spirit of advocacy. And I think you'll hear as many questions as answers, and I think this is the beginning of a conversation, because it is the question of whether India and China can coexist peacefully this century is of deep concern and relevance to all of us. So my presentation is actually titled India and China, Past, Present and Future. How do we recognise rivalry? And I guess there's a question mark there. Because I'd start with the point that there's been a real vogue recently in journalism and apparent strategic analysis that there is such a thing as rivalry between China and India. What I want to do in the next few minutes is unpack this question a bit. What is rivalry in terms of geopolitics, in terms of relations between countries? What are the indicators of it? How will we know if a rivalry is emerging between the two most populous states in the world and the two rising powers of the Asian century? And if that rivalry is evolving, how can those countries, or indeed others, help to manage or minimise its harmful consequences? So first, what is rivalry? And I guess this picture reminds one of the, there's an apparent saying that's quoted sometimes on India-China relations: can two tigers share a mountain? And I'll leave it to you to decide which tiger is which in that picture. But of course, don't always assume that the one that's on top at the moment is the one that's going to be on top by the end of by the end. I think I would avoid simplistic notions that any state of competition between two relatively powerful countries is rivalry. I think it's much more sophisticated than that. And I wouldn't use the term rivalry until I could start meeting some of these, answering some of these questions, or meeting some of these criteria. Is it an extreme case of competition between two countries for relative influence in the world? Are they willing to risk war with one another? Are their vital interests at stake, and the interests that they define as their vital interests? Is it a rivalry, or is it a contest that spans many dimensions of power and influence? Not only diplomacy, not only military, not only economics, not only soft power, the attempt to attract rather than compel. And can rivalry be one-sided? I don't think so. And I think one of the challenges in looking at India-China relations is the question that is it at the moment? Of course, India tends to pay a lot more attention to China than China does to India. But will that change? So in answering some of those questions, I'm not going to go into history in detail because we've heard, I think, a very illuminating view from a very experienced and learned Indian speaker this morning on the questions of India's history and the history of India-China relations. Now, there are many interpretations that can be placed on that period of history, and I guess I would ask the question: was it always unrealistic? Was Nehru's vision of brotherhood between India and China always unrealistic, or was there a moment when it could have been different? Because I think that does help inform what the two countries can do into the future, and I guess I would tend more to a pessimistic assessment of that. But anyway, the history, the fact is the war happened. It may not have been India's China war or China's India war, but it happened. It was a war between those two powers, and I think it was an instance where I don't think the hand of a third party could be identified. And I think it does hold lessons to this day for the two countries and others to be aware of, because apart from anything else, there was a clear failure of diplomatic signalling, a clear failure of calculation between those two countries. And of course, in those days, the stakes were much smaller. Neither of those were nuclear-armed powers, for example. After the war, after 1962, there was a deep sense of betrayal in India at many levels, and relations were frosty between China and India. It was compounded, of course, by the Chinese nuclear tests only 2 years later. Moving into the 70s, I think the strengthening of very close ties between China and Pakistan only deepened the sense of mistrust and betrayal in parts of the Indian establishment. And of course, I think whatever you might say about China-Pakistan relations or about India's perception of China, in my view, it's the Chinese assistance to Pakistan's nuclear and missile programs that is now well documented. Of course, bomb blueprints found in Libya that originated ultimately from China via Pakistan are one of the pieces of testimony to that. I think that is, more than anything else, is what makes so many Indian strategic thinkers so mistrustful of China, and it's going to be so hard, I think, to break that perception. But things improved, and the instances, the 8.5-minute handshake, I wasn't aware, sir, that it was quite of that duration, so that's something I've learned this morning. The improvement in the 80s and the 90s, the fact that these two powers did begin to recognise mutual interests, particularly mutual economic interests, could only be to the good. There were pretty historic deals in the 90s to improve stability on the border. But I would take the view that a diplomatic high point in the relationship was reached in the period between 2000 and 2005, and that we've already passed that high point. It's going to be very difficult, I think, to go back to that high point, and the choices to achieve that are not going to be India's alone, and nor, incidentally, will they be America's alone either. I just want to talk a little bit about the economic side of the relationship, because I think that's where a lot of the good news is. Now, obviously, we know about the growth, the spectacular growth in both economies, and here you have some pretty linear, unsophisticated, well, sophisticated at one level, but very linear projections of how big India and China's economies could be by the middle of the century, assuming that most of the things that could go wrong don't go wrong. Nonetheless, I think unless we have some pretty spectacular catastrophe in either or both countries, these will be two of the great three economies of the century. And I think India will begin to close the gap with China to perhaps 40% of the size of the Chinese economy. And with that will go a rise in defence spending. Now, I understand the points my colleague has made about the weaknesses in India's defence establishment, and of course, China too has its own officer crisis. So I think these things are not unique to India. But even with all of the inbuilt restraints and flaws and so forth, if Indian defence spending grows in tandem with the growth of the Indian economy, India will be the third largest military spender by a long way in decades to come. And I think this set of statistics, these projections, give you a sense of this. The country flatlining at the bottom there is Japan. So even with all of the flaws in the Indian system, unless something changes rather dramatically, India will be a serious military power in the world, and we have to be aware of this. Trade between India and China, there's been dramatic growth, and again, that's part of the good news. I think one of the disappointments from an Indian point of view is how much that trade is in China's favour. But we've seen absolutely spectacular growth in the last decade or so. Now, there has been diplomatic cooperation between the two countries. Again, there is good news in that sense, but I tend to be of the view that a lot of this cooperation has been over specific issues at specific times rather than systematic cooperation, rather than true partnership. We like, for example, to talk about cooperation on climate change, and certainly there are very common interests that India and China have at the moment on climate change, much to the frustration of Kevin Rudd and others at Copenhagen in 2009. And there was the energy partnership that we've heard something about today that I know Manishankar Iyer was heavily involved in. But it strikes me that these efforts have generally been relatively short-lived. They haven't been sustained for all kinds of reasons we can go into if there's time. On the military front, yes, there's some good news. I think the degree of so-called confidence-building measures, CBMs, as the security boffins like to say, has improved between the two countries. What's interesting is at the moment, China is very reluctant to enter into confidence-building measures with its neighbours at sea, and there's a huge frustration over that because there are real dangers of conflict arising at sea because of a lack of communication, a lack of rules and protocols. There's been a better relationship between India and China on land in that regard than there has been with China and others at sea, and I'm curious as to know why Chinese defence thinkers think that somehow the risks of war at sea are less than the risks of war at land, but that's a question I guess they can answer. There have been joint or combined exercises between the two countries, dialogues evolving, port calls by each other's navies and so on. So some modest good news on that front. And they do recognise some threats in common, all of the so-called transnational security threats. But there's another side, and I want to spend most of the rest of my time just quickly racing through some of the risks that I see in the relationship, the way that it could evolve from what at the moment I would categorise not as rivalry but as competitive coexistence, if you like, to something more worrying. Now, it's true there are fundamental commonalities between these two countries, common interests, that fundamental interest of providing development, human security for massive populations, to lift them to a higher quality of life and dignity. The danger is that these don't always translate into common action, and in fact, if you look at some of the incidents in recent years, some of the other forces at work, common interests like the need for energy, the need for water, internal stability and so forth, can actually become competitive dynamics of themselves if not carefully managed by the two governments. The fact, for example, that the media in both countries can really take some quite extreme views or can inflame the situation, even when incidents may or may not have occurred. Media coverage can sometimes put pressure on governments to act, and I know my colleague here, Ashok Malik, has written about this. Incidents that may or may not have occurred on the India-China frontier some years ago were beaten up into the Indian media until there was very heavy pressure on the Indian government to do or say something about it. That's a worry in my view. In China, of course, Chinese diplomats now like to say that China has to be responsive to public opinion too, the so-called netizens, and there's a lot of pretty harsh nationalism in those quarters, including notably in relation to India in recent years. The border dispute continues to be really quite central to the future of the relationship, and there was a time a few years ago where one was receiving messages from Chinese diplomats, Indian diplomats, saying that it was almost resolved, that the contours of a solution had been found. But that was before 2005, and I think the strengthening of the US-India relationship in particular since then, and other factors I think that have led to a more assertive stance by China, have meant that I don't think the border is any closer to resolution now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. The maritime domain's becoming increasingly an area of competition. There are stories circulating of an apparent incident between an Indian ship and some sort of Chinese unit, maybe a ship, maybe not, in the South China Sea recently. We don't know how true that is, but certainly as the interests of these two countries grow, their energy interests, their reliance on sea lanes and so forth, thank you, it's inevitable that their navies will brush up against each other more at sea, and therefore they need much clearer rules of communication, dialogue, understanding, confidence building to avoid encounters that could get out of hand. We've heard a little bit about the role of Tibet in all of this, the fact that I think the Chinese anxiety over the India-China border has a strong relationship to the succession of the Dalai Lama. And until we see who the next Dalai Lama is and how that succession goes, I think there'll be continued Chinese nervousness over the Indian dimension there. We've seen jostling in regional diplomatic forums, forums that are meant to be about cooperation. China tried to keep India out of the East Asia Summit in 2005. It's now a matter of public record. I have difficulty reconciling that with a cooperative vision of the India-China relationship. And it goes on. I won't go into detail here, but both countries are modernising their militaries, however fitfully, however unsuccessfully in some ways. And it's true that China is not looking to India as a primary threat in the way that some Indian security thinkers are looking to China. And I don't think that will change quickly. But 20 years from now, if the Indian Ocean becomes a centre of China's, central to China's energy requirements, if China fears a risk of being blockaded in the Indian Ocean, then I think it will look more closely to India as a point of concern. Economically, yes, it's mostly good news, but as India moves to a more manufacturing economy, I think we will see more direct economic competition between the two countries. So I wouldn't say that it's entirely a rosy future there, and this Hyundai factory in India is perhaps a sign of what is to come there. And of course, despite the energy partnership in 2005, there have been many instances since then of China continuing to outbid India in competition for resources internationally. Soft power, I think, look, I think it's not yet a contest in an extreme way, and that's a good thing. I don't think there is a direct effort by either country to outflank the other in that way. And there have been some interesting lessons of the failures of both countries. Of course, I think neither's hosting of spectacular games in recent years was the great soft power triumph that perhaps it could have been. So at this stage, I wouldn't say there's soft power rivalry. And as for soft power partnership, I don't know if any of you have seen this film, but you know, I've seen some fantastic Indian films and some pretty good Chinese films, and this isn't one of them. Look, just to move quickly to the future, you'll see more in my paper that there are 4 areas where I point to, if you like, forces that are not entirely within India's or China's control that may help shape this relationship. We've heard a bit about the US-India relationship. I won't go into it a lot more now. I do tend to take the view that the US expects of India not some sort of client state or alliance status, but India just being India will be enough from a US perspective to add a degree of balance to the Asian power system. I think relations between Pakistan and China are absolutely fundamental. Until China prioritises India over Pakistan, I can't see serious security trust or partnership between those two great powers. On the nuclear dimension, I think there are risks here. I think the fact that China does not acknowledge that India has any legitimate right to possess nuclear weapons is a fundamental danger and asymmetry in the relationship. Until the two countries can talk openly with each other about their possession of nuclear weapons and build a regime of confidence building and rules, for example, a no first use agreement, I think there's going to be a dangerous nuclear dimension there. And finally, we've talked about the maritime dimension already, which I think is going to get more challenging in the years to come. I had a concluding section on what this means for Australia. I'll simply say that both these countries matter deeply to us. You can see from these trade statistics, but also strategically, at a human dimension, the growth of Indian and Chinese communities in this country. And it is a good thing, but it does add attention to our diplomacy in the future. There's a third person in this picture who you may recognise. It seems that the two gentlemen on the right and left are taking no notice of him whatsoever, and I won't comment on that. Or on what sort of a metaphor that might be. But Australia, this matters to Australia, this relationship. And whether they take notice of our views or not, there are going to be all sorts of tensions and dilemmas that this will open up for us, and I've identified a few of them there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Marika and Rory. It's now some time for some audience participation. We've only got around 10 minutes left. We might steal 1 or 2 minutes of the lunch break because we did start late. Because we have very strong lights in our eyes, if you wish to ask a question, please put your hand up and move it so I can spot the movement. I imagine there will be some roving microphones. Yes? Can't see. If not, speak in a very loud voice and please introduce yourself very briefly. Also, try and keep your questions fairly short so we can have a large number of participants.
I'd like to make one observation, and that is, I take an issue with Marika's comments in relation to the Islamic minority in India. The Islamic minority in India is treated better, has better rights than Islamic majority in many Muslim countries. That's the observation I'd like to make. And secondly, it should be recognized that India's economic development and progress is going to be slower than China. In fact, even Australia can grow at 10% plus, provided it adopts the Chinese system of politics. Are we willing to pay that price? You should ponder over that.
Marika, would you want to take that as a comment or would you like to respond?
I think it's just a comment.
Okay. Over here, and remember to introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, panel members. I'm Strobe Driver. I'm from the University of Ballarat, and I'm particularly interested in the military aspect that you've been talking about. My question is, isn't part of the reason that the Indian military has been incapable of dealing with insurgents is because of the hangover of the British days in terms of being trained, the Indian military being trained for broad front confrontations. And moreover, and on top of that, I detect some reluctance on the part of India to embrace the fact that it's a superpower and that's the way it's going to be. It will become a superpower. And do you think some of the problems and issues that you have spoken about will in fact be moderated once India embraces the fact that it will become a superpower in the region, at least in the region, in the short time? Thank you.
I think we can both have a go, huh?
Your mic, you can probably stay where you are if you want.
Oh, really? Yeah. Oh, even better.
Your mic should carry.
See if it works.
Okay.
Save time.
Sure. I think the greatest problem in India dealing with its insurgency, the Maoist one, is the lack of information. And it's taken India a very long time to realize how serious it really is. Only recently, you know, we had an election campaign called India Shining. And that is, if you like, a symbol of how India itself has begun to believe in the global hype about what it represents. Now, I've spent a lot of time working on Indian economic development and Indo-Australia joint ventures, and I'm a great admirer of what India has actually achieved economically and in the business world. But in the end, a modern state does have to deliver meaningful lives to ordinary people. Paradoxically, and I'd argued this before, this is something that India actually does share with the US. Now we know that the US at the moment has got about 36 million really poor people, but it's had 26 million really poor people for most of the Second World War period. What does this mean? It worries me. It is possible, looking at the US model, it's possible to become a superpower and tolerate mass poverty within your own borders. Whether that's possible for India, however, is a different issue because this Maoist insurgency is in the rural areas, which remain very isolated, and it's very hard to get there. You actually have to believe that if you're a military person, you've got to believe you're fighting for a good cause. And we know that from resignations and suicides, that some of the top people in the Indian armed forces don't actually believe in their mission. Rory.
Yeah, right. Look, two good questions there. Firstly, to clarify, the Indian military is not fighting the Naxalites. It's the police that are fighting the Naxalites. And there are some people in the security sector in India who would say that's part of the problem. There are others who would say, you know, a political solution should be paramount. But I don't think we can use the Naxalite example to ask that question. Counterinsurgency in Kashmir is another story. You know, a mixed record, but you certainly can't say that there's been a lack of experience on that front in the last 20 years. And look, there's no, I mean, what country are we benchmarking India against? What country would be able to handle that kind of chaos, insurgency and bloodshed, you know, on its periphery or within part of its territory, and come out with an impeccable record? I don't know. So I mean, I think there's a mixed story there. I think the question about India as a superpower, personally, I won't use that term superpower and apply it to India, not for at least a couple of decades. I think the next 2 decades are a huge question, a huge race against time for India to either meet the demands of its 600 million people under the age of 25 or not. And if India does that, then maybe India will be a superpower. But there are Indians who do believe in power and who believe that, like it or not, India will be a power. And I think the way India is using that power is evolving. We're seeing a mixture of restraint, a mixture of the use of coercion. That's a work in progress. We'll know that India's arrived when it has the kind of power that it doesn't need to use in order to get what it wants. That's not yet.
Okay, down the front here. Remember to introduce yourself.
I'm Rick Smith, a retired public servant in another parish of this shire. Marika, a question here, if I may. I was very interested in your use of the term contain. Can the US and India contain China? The inference I draw from that is you think that they should or that they are trying. Could I put it to you that, as far as I know at least, neither country uses that term, nor do they aspire to contain? Could I put it to you also that any endeavour to contain in this time contains high risk? And finally put it to you that the biggest of those risks is that it would not work. There's no containing. The horses are well and truly out of the stable. They're not only in the top paddock, they're all over the farm. Contain is a term of another era, and as I see it, it's not what anyone is seeking to do.
Yeah, you're right. No one who's got an ounce of diplomatic education uses the terminology, but that's what they all talk about privately and in other fora. For example, even ASEAN, you know, the Asian way or the ASEAN way, we had a visiting delegation from the Indonesian government late last year, and we were astonished to discover that they came to see what did academics in Australia think about allowing East Timor to join ASEAN. The Indonesians were very keen. Singapore was opposing it. Equally astonishing, we found out that the reason Indonesia wanted to bring East Timor into ASEAN was because they were very worried about the growing influence of China in East Timor. Soft power at the moment through massive loans, aid, but they pointed out that even the Ministry for Foreign Affairs building in Dili was built by and financed by the Chinese. Also, over many decades, in my fairly frank discussions with Indian diplomats, people have been quite frank, and I don't think there is any point in just mincing words and being... The job of an academic is to be honest, not diplomatic. But Indian diplomats have said, for example, our nuclear bomb has got nothing to do with Pakistan. It's China-specific. And this is not just right-wing people in India saying that. This is security experts from a whole range of different persuasions in India.
Can I add two? Oh, Rick.
Is not counter. Countering is one thing. Containing is another term. It's a term of Cold War Soviet-USSR.
Can I?
Is applying that concept to China. Countering, yes.
Can I add two small points to that? Firstly, I'd agree with Rick Smith on that point because containment in the Cold War definition had an economic dimension. Nobody is trying to quarantine China economically. It's not in our interest, it's not in India's interest. So I don't think any country in Asia, I mean, it would be insane to have that kind of relationship with China. So for that reason, apart from anything else, I think the use of the word containment is analytically inaccurate. Regarding the strategies of other countries, of course everyone in the region, not everyone, but many powers in the region are concerned about China's growing power and what it means. And of course they're looking for ways to protect their interests, balance if you like. And of course the Indian nuclear deterrent is at least in part, possibly in large part, about China, but I wouldn't call that containment. So.
Okay, we're going to have one more very short question and then it'll be lunchtime. Down the front here. Wait for the microphone so everyone at the back can hear.
My name is Ashok Malik. I'm a columnist working in New Delhi. My question's for Rory. In your work and your experience, have you detected any sort of pattern to how China seeks to influence domestic policy debates in democracies?
Look, that's too big a question for just India. Oh, yeah, and I don't mean that India is small. I think, just one or two brief comments. I'm wary of assessments that China has some sort of grand plan about how it engages with the world. China's a country like any other in the sense that it has contending forces for influence within China, and I think some elements of the Chinese polity are engaging in some ways, others are being much more assertive. They're not always talking to each other. They're just like us in that sense. However, I think there have been some pretty ham-fisted attempts to exert influence. I mean, for example, the orchestrated protests in countries like Australia during the Olympic torch relay were an example of how not to influence policy in a democracy. That, more than anything alone, I think, turned much of Australian public opinion, which had been quite comfortable with China's rise, in the opposite direction. Look, I think generally, though, Chinese influence, attempts to exert influence are pretty pragmatic, and a lot of it's about getting business access and about economic access to resources rather than trying to change policies of countries like Australia. They can do diplomatic démarches all they like. Countries like Australia are still going to speak with countries like India when they wish.
Well, thank you. Well, the conference is clearly not just warmed up, but it's now firing. Yeah. But you're probably all ready for lunch. So I would like to thank our speakers, Rory Metcalfe and Marika Vitsiani, for a fantastic presentation.